Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for today is Nikki Stewart, and she is the executive director of Old North Illuminated. Nikki Stewart is a creative and collaborative leader with over 15 years of nonprofit management experience. Her current organization, Old North Illuminated, operates Old North Church and Historic Site, a role that blends her strategic leadership and fundraising expertise with her passion for connecting audiences to local history. Previously, Nikki has served as Vice President of Development at United South End Settlements, where she led the organization's fundraising and communication efforts through an ambitious growth phase that included the implementation of a 5-year strategic plan and launch of a capital campaign. For these accomplishments, Nikki was named the 2019 Outstanding Fundraising Rising Star by AFP Massachusetts. She also launched the Changemaker Dinner Series, which was awarded the Get Connected GK10 Award in 2018, naming it one of the top 10 ideas advancing radical equity in the city of Boston. Nikki received a Juris Doctor and bachelor's degree from Northeastern University. She is a graduate of the course in exceptional fundraising at the Kennedy School of Government and Harvard University, as well as the Institute for Nonprofit Practice. She is the co-founder and sometimes host of the Hub History podcast, featuring 300 plus episodes on Boston history and an award-winning apple pie baker. Yum. Welcome, Nikki, to the show. I'd love for you to share just a little bit about yourself personally before we dive into our conversation about professionals in the nonprofit sector.
Well, my fun fact was going to be that I'm an award-winning apple pie baker, but I forgot that I had put that
Well,
in my
tell us a
bio.
little more about your apple pie, because I'm a big apple pie fan, and but I have found people's idea of what makes an amazing apple pie varies. So what is how
Well,
do you
that's true.
define a great apple pie for yourself?
So, first of all, it is my mother's
Mm.
recipe, so I feel compelled to put that out there
Yeah.
right away. I did not develop the recipe. I implemented, though. So it is a caramel apple pie.
Okay.
And your comment is interesting because my husband contends that it's not an apple pie, it's actually a cheesecake.
Ooh.
However, the judges of this particular contest did feel that it was an apple pie, and in fact, they felt that it was the best apple pie. So it's their opinion that I go off
Excellent.
of.
Well, I'd love to try it someday. I am gluten-free, so these days all my pies have to be with gluten-free crusts. But yeah,
I think that's a possibility with this pie.
definitely.
And I will say, it's not a secret. My family doesn't keep recipes secret. We'll put them out there.
Excellent.
So you know what? You can put it in the show
Well,
notes if you want. I will
let's
send
do
you the
that. Let's put it
recipe.
in the show notes, because actually, well, maybe it's too soon to tease this, but I've been working behind the scenes, kind of writing a book, and I decided right in my intro, you know what? I'm going to share my famous gluten-free brownie recipe, because I'm also all about sharing the secret sauce with as many people as want to drink it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, apple pie recipes withstanding, I know you're all going to check out the show notes for that. Let's talk about nonprofits. You've had quite a career, not just in them, but inspiring nonprofit leaders. And I'd love to ask you about, so many young professionals are drawn into the sector by their passion for a specific mission or cause, not necessarily because they're in love with the nonprofit business model. But how can they leverage that passion into career growth, maybe going from eventually one nonprofit to another nonprofit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say I was that person. I can't identify as a young professional anymore. And so I'm sure some of my comments will date myself as an elder millennial. But I was that person who entered the nonprofit sector through through an AmeriCorps
Mm.
Vista fellowship. And so I did that with a youth arts organization called Zoomix in East Boston. And in some ways, it looks strange on paper because I had just graduated from law school. And that's not where I intended to be. But then a recession hit. And what I loved about Zoomix, and this was totally a passion match. So when I went for the interview, it was in like, it felt like it was in somebody's garage, like it was an older facility, total nonprofit space, right? Like people are sharing desks that are only sized for one person. It's like practically a double decker situation. Um, but it felt so much
Mm.
like home. And so I was a musician as a child and a teenager. And so that was a passion match for me. And I think I've been pretty lucky to have passion matches since then. But also, I'm not doing programming, right? I started out doing fundraising and then expanded my management profile. But, the passion has never, for me, led to direct service, which I actually believe I would not be good at all.
I love that you share that because so many providers are pulled in to direct service initially. And then I think they struggle to move from there. I think they feel like they're abandoning it when they do something else for the organization. But I bet you would have some thoughts on, when you're doing something other than direct service, do you feel like you're contributing in a very meaningful way?
I do. And I think I look at it from the pragmatic lens of, using Zoomix as an example. Youth don't get free music lessons if their teaching artists don't get
That's
paid.
right.
Or, if nobody opens the building this morning, right? So there are all of these going to say thankless, but maybe hidden aspects of what it looks like to execute a
Yeah.
mission. Somebody has to stuff the envelopes, somebody has to pay the electrical bill, but that is critically important. And those are valuable skill sets, right? Like not everybody can pay a bill
That's
on
right.
time. Not everybody can, do QuickBooks accounting.
Yeah.
So
That's Mhm.
it really takes all of these skill sets to
It
execute a mission.
does. It makes me think of my mother, whose kind of fault it is that I ended up in the nonprofit space. I went to this small independent school. I mean, it was really teeny. It was like 20 kids when I started there in kindergarten. And around 3rd grade for me, the school was really struggling financially. They were losing, their lease, they hadn't filed their taxes properly, and they couldn't afford even to hire a bookkeeper, and my mom, as a parent, just volunteered. She wasn't a professional bookkeeper, but she knew how to do it. She knew the tool, and she's like, "Well, somebody's gotta do this," and she just got into those nuts and bolts, saved the school. The teachers were about to work for no pay. She managed to grow. She figured out she needed to grow the student body enough to be a sustainable business model. And there she was. She says like zero ego. And had this kind of thankless job in the summer. She'd be the only one there in her teeny little office. I remember she finally got herself an air conditioner because there was no air conditioning. It was super hot on the top
I'm sure
floor.
she bought it herself and
Yeah,
installed it
teeny little
herself.
window air conditioner, and there she would be making sure that the bills were paid, and it's harder to pay your bills when you're, on a razor thin budget and building the staff and making sure enrollment happened, doing all those details by herself summer after summer, and she ended up doing that job for 17 years, long after I left. But the school would not be around today. It's still around today. It would not be around today if somebody hadn't done that work because programming alone does not make a nonprofit run. So I'm curious, as you think about your own journey, what would you say to other people who are wanting to like have a career? Maybe they're listening, they're like, yep, I got sucked in, it was my passion, But now I'm thinking about really making this a career. And do I want to stay in programming? Do I want to go into fundraising? What do I want to be doing? What kind of tips would you give to them?
Well, I think it has been helpful to me to have been in smaller organizations. Now, I'll be honest, as we all know, there are some downsides to being in smaller organizations. It's a smaller team, so it's sometimes harder to stay afloat. But it gives you a lot more opportunities to see what it takes to run an organization. And so I think if there's an opportunity or, a choice to be made about going to a large institution, and, or being part of even a larger department in a bigger institution, that's a setting where you're going to learn your particular craft very,
Mm,
very well, right? Compare that
mhm,
to if my first job had been as a grant writer in a hospital or a university. I would be like probably a better grant writer than I am today, but I wouldn't have gotten from that how to run an organization, let alone, how to run a department. And so I think it's important to then think about, well, what do you really want to
mm,
get out of a particular job at a particular time in your career? And to think about, do I want to be in a big shop or a small shop? Do I want to be in the office every day or do I want to be working from home? Right? There's all of these trade-offs. And I think I also, as a result of being in smaller organizations, and I'll just give the context. So for me, those have been organizations with like 20 to 50 staff, I would say, at any given time. Uh, I've also been fortunate in that, except for a very brief stint in the middle, I always reported directly to the executive director or the
mhm.
CEO. And I think that's rare, right? For me to come in as an AmeriCorps Vista, it's just because there wasn't a fundraising department yet. So even though I was entry level, I was still reporting to the ED. And that is probably the most impactful part of my career, was being able to see these various leaders really up close and personal, and to have relationships with them where I could help be a problem solver, I could be a sounding board. I could hear from them directly, like, what's keeping them up at night, what are they worried about. um, and I think, that's hard as well. Like, you can't always manufacture that. And so I think having, um, positive relationships with your leadership team is really what's going to get you that insight. And now you only have control over half of that equation, but it's really important
Yeah,
insight.
you're really making me reflect on my own experience coming up in the nonprofit space was very much in small organizations where I was very close and I had to learn a lot of skills because they were small, everything from, building websites to fixing the toilets to I ended up learning bookkeeping when I was organizing a conference. I'd been submitting my receipts to the bookkeeper. And then after the conference, I asked for like a detailed report of all my spending and I gave her every receipt and the category that it should go in, and she couldn't give me a proper report. And I was like, "What's going on here?" And my mom, I said it was partly her fault. She's like, "Oh, you can learn QuickBooks." So before I knew it, I took the QuickBooks file home. And then I was like I did pick it up and I was deep in forensic accounting and I discovered that like this organization had a wealthy funder founder who every time they ran out of cash would just put more money in the bank and nobody was ever thinking really so closely about reports. Nothing shady was going on. Just nobody had caught that it wasn't really that well organized because there was always
Yeah.
money to add to the bank and people were just looking at their bank account rather than reports like I was. But that got me this opportunity. And if it hadn't been a small organization, and if I hadn't worked closely with the executive director, I wouldn't have the opportunity to say, "Hey, can I just take the QuickBooks file home and play around with it and see what's happening?" So I think you're
Yeah.
absolutely right that that can be really important. What would you say for new employees who maybe don't have, the luck of being in such a teeny close relationship as you and I have had for making a good impression and demonstrating their potential to the leaders in their organization?
Yeah. I think one thing that can have an impact, and I'm thinking of this because as you were just talking, I was thinking about, the conversations I have now with my peers at other organizations or, people who are working maybe at the director level. And we often lament about how it feels like some of the newer or younger staff like don't understand what our jobs
Mm,
are. And of course they don't. If they haven't read our literal job descriptions, and that's assuming that those are even accurate, like of course they don't. But I think taking the time to figure out, okay, so you're in a larger organization, right? I'm going to imagine what that might be like. So you can't do this with everyone, but you have to think like who are the people who are important to your position? And I think that it is worth asking them to, have a cup of coffee or to have a Zoom and just ask them questions about like what their day-to-day work is like. Um, I'm thinking as an example, a friend of mine who is a finance and operations director. And I think that if a younger or newer staff member came to her and said, Chrissy, what's your job like? What do you do all day? And like, is there anything I can do to help that go smoothly? Like, wow, that would be amazing. And I think what she would say is things like, make sure you submit your timesheet.
mhm.
you know
Yeah,
like just simple things, or when give me a receipt, can you write the code on the top of it, right? There are always like three things that we wish people were doing for us, but that makes such a good
yeah.
impression. Is that alone going to get you the promotion? Like, no, you're gonna have to do more work than that, but it means that those people are going to know who you are and think about you
Yeah,
favorably,
and
and
so
that's huge.
favorably. I coach executive directors, and one of the things I hear a lot is two things. One, it's a lonely job. And two is they all think about quitting, but they are too passionate about what's being accomplished to actually quit. But I think, when I think about those folks and even myself, like you will gain so much just to come to somebody who's in a lonely job and to have that curiosity is going to mean a lot to them. I know like a lot of nonprofit leaders or executive directors, if they have an office, they show up before everybody else. Nobody knows what time they get to work, right? Unless they ask. Because often I know I was usually there, a couple hours before anybody else. So I got work done. I had challenges. I had an assistant who had not half her job, but part of her job, we'd always laugh, was finding my cup of coffee because I was always getting interrupted and having to go through the building. It was an after school program. And I was like constantly setting my coffee down because I got in a conversation and then interrupted to go somewhere else. And I was like constantly losing my cup of coffee. It became this ridiculous joke, but indicative of being the person who was accountable for a lot of things and having a lot of people who wanted my attention every day. And if somebody had taken the time to know those things, I certainly would have thought about them favorably for sure. So
Yeah.
what do you think
Yeah.
on the flip side of that? You mentioned your other executive director friends. Um, what would you advise those folks to be thinking about as they look at their team, especially younger team members, and how they might advance or bring those folks along?
Yeah. Well, I think I would give them advice that I myself find it difficult to follow. Um, so I mentioned earlier that I don't think I'm cut out for direct service. And so part of that is because I am a terrible teacher or conveyor of information. It's in my head, right? And I did have this moment maybe about 2 years into my current position as an ED where I just felt like, "Oh my gosh, like I'm not setting my team up for
Mm,
success because we are doing so well as an organization. We've had an incredible rebound from the pandemic years, and I don't think I've told people how we did that." Right. I mean, people participate in the process. And so, you're seeing it bit by bit, or, you proofread this grant or you did that thing. But I hadn't like set up my team to understand why I made the decisions that I did and why, one thing led to another. And now we're in this good position today. And so I think that it's really important to understand that, as an executive director or even the leader of a larger department, you're like looking at the big picture all the time, but that's not what your staff are tasked with doing. And sometimes we get disgruntled when they do. We say, stay in your lane, or I didn't ask for your input. So I think that it's important to carve out specific time and like channels to teach a little bit and to help people understand why you're doing the things you're doing and making the decisions that you're making.
Yeah, I think that is really, really important. And I've always been a big believer of, as much as possible as a leader, to leverage everybody's brain in your organization and to empower them to make as many decisions, to not be bottlenecking decisions at the executive director level. I had my eyes opened up to that reading a book called The Great Game of Business, which is not known in nonprofit circles necessarily. Have you heard of it? By Jack?
I have not
Yeah,
heard of it.
you wouldn't necessarily, but it's called The Great Game of Business. It's by Jack Stack, and, he basically created this model of open book management. He'd taken over, I think it was, a tractor engine remanufacturing company, like where they rebuild used tractor engines, like pretty blue collar, and it was failing.
Yes.
So I think he was able to acquire it for very little money, and because it was like losing money, and he turned it into one of the most profitable, successful businesses in the country by teaching everybody who worked there how to read the financial statements and opening up decisions to pretty much everybody with this full understanding. Everybody knew everything about the money, and creating incentives, profit based incentives for everybody who worked there. And now everybody knew how the money worked. And they turned that factory around into a highly profitable company that paid its employees very well. They had set, I think, a goal for every employee should be able to make enough to own a nice home and give back to charity in their communities. And and it's a nice story, but it was also, I think about from a leadership perspective to this day, how scary it is to think about turning over that level of information and power to our employees. But at the end of the day, it leverages every bit of brain power that you have, and you can get incredible results and
Yeah.
incredible ideas.
And there's no reason not to share it, right?
No,
Like in a nonprofit, your financials are publicly available
that's right.
information. There's really no
I
need
think nonprofits get
not to
extra
share it.
nervous, and it's extra silly because of that reason. Like, we can just look up your financials, right? Like, it's really not a
Yeah,
secret.
they're just
Yeah,
there. I had a moment, I guess last year at this point, where I felt like, why am I the only person worried about revenue? That's bananas. Like, we all have to start talking
yeah.
about this. And so when we opened for the season this year, I had said to the education department, I think like our ticketing model is confusing. There's too many options. Like, it's hard for somebody at the front of the line to digest all of these options and make a quick decision. And so I had proposed a new model of like a combo pass. And they had said pretty quickly, no, like, I don't think your idea is going to work. Let me tell you why. I was like, okay. But then within a few days, they had come up with an alternative combo pass that has been wildly successful. And that's only been possible because I had that moment of, oh, I don't think I should have to carry this weight alone. Like, we're all in it together. Like, let's just solve
That's
problems
right.
together.
And I think any executive director would definitely resonate with, wouldn't it be nice to have a bunch of other people to worry with me? And while we don't want a nonprofit full of worriers, I think what's underneath that is if more people are taking accountability for the most important parts of our organizations, it runs better and there's less to worry about for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that then comes to mind is, I don't spend time in the ticket booth, right? So I actually need the perspective of the staff who have those interactions
That's
day to
right.
day. And I feel like there's a real art to being able to say to your supervisor or, someone in leadership, okay, I know that you told me to do X, but I saw Y. Seems like maybe there's a conflict there. Can we talk about
Yeah,
that? You know,
absolutely.
because it's like, because that's pushback. That's like, well, if you think I'm about to make a bad decision because you know something that I don't, please tell me. Like, and again, I think there's an art to figuring out how your supervisor wants to receive that type of feedback. But also, if you have a supervisor who doesn't want that feedback, you got to get
Yeah.
out. Like, that's time to get a
Yeah.
new job.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, but I want to come back to that idea in just a moment. I want to share with all of you out there who are getting value and insight from the interviews in the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership podcast that I know how busy you are, and I know how helpful it can be to get quick reminders of the things that are maybe important but not urgent. And that is why I have created the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter for you, which you can access at inspirednonprofitleadership.com. There'll be a link in the show notes as well. And you will get bite-sized weekly tips that are highly actionable to help you be an even better leader in your organization. All right, back to my conversation with Nikki. I think what you just said is so interesting. So much of my work has been about transforming leadership systems that leaders use so that scenario of it being this tricky conversation of somebody having to say to their supervisor, actually, it might work better in this other way. I like to just dismantle that whole system and have it work differently so that supervisors essentially aren't supervisors. They're people who are accountable for outcomes. And they say, hey, we need ticketing to take less time. Give me the solution. and and
Yeah.
they're not actually in charge of that person's behavior. They're only accountable for watching the outcome. Has it been simplified? Yes or no? And what else might we try, or what other information can we get that will help us create a better solution? But that is a reality for many of my clients. It's not a reality for many people out there. So, how do you deal as somebody's supervisor? How do you deal with being on the receiving end of that communication? And I'll ask you at the same time, what is it that people who come to you, what can they do to make it easier for you on your end as a supervisor?
Well, I feel like I've had the benefit of reporting to people who have different styles in that regard. Really across the spectrum from, an ED who like truly in her heart believes in like the value of every person's brain in the organization, like equally, to a CEO who was more of, well, I don't necessarily want to know if you think I'm making a mistake. I will deal with that on my
Mm-hmm.
own. So inherently, I think I've seen what works, and I understand what feels good also. Um, so I find that to be kind of a hard question to answer. I feel like that's really a question for my team of what have I done? Um, I mean, I think I've just tried to really come at problem solving as a team sport
Mhm.
uh, in this organization. And again, that wasn't necessarily what my first year or so was like. Um, and I think, I have a tendency when the pressure is on to turn inward and to say, well, I have faith in me. I can hit this deadline if I just buckle down, or like I can solve this problem. Um, but I have been, my colleagues have demonstrated many times that they're here for a reason, and in a lot of ways they have more experience than
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of, so I'm a sailboat racer. and I race on a boat. I'm the skipper, and I have a very competent team. I'm usually bringing a new person along, and training them up, and have a few very skilled team members, which helps us win. But it's one of those leadership experiences where you have to learn that lesson because you physically cannot, at least on our boat, right? It's not set up for one person to do. You cannot do all the things yourself. It is not an option. But it is still one boat. You have to get everybody. And it becomes really clear that one, you need skilled people, but two, you need them all working in a coordinated dance. And so you have these two roles, which I think is very much like as executive directors, one which you mentioned, teaching, training, getting people's skills up or practice up where they need a little more practice, and then how supporting your team in getting coordinated. And sometimes that means telling them what to do, but so often that means giving them a space, saying, hey, why don't the two of you get together, and work through how to coordinate these movements, which usually have to be done under a great deal of pressure and changing circumstances every few seconds. We've got a whole new dynamic on the sailboat. And so we're scenario planning and enacting like crazy in that environment. That's one of my favorite things about sailing, besides just the joy of being out there, is it is this like super condensed leadership environment that I always get lessons from, and it keeps it like very compounded that way.
Yeah. I think what that makes me think of is, both from an employee's perspective, but also from management, is really putting more value on the skill set than the subject
Mm,
matter expertise or experience. And maybe that's something that younger staff can take away is it's really not like how much going back to my like Zoomix analogies, not like how much you know about teaching music necessarily, but like, can you solve a
yes.
problem? You know, can you, like, if two
Mm,
of your students show up at the same time, can you figure out how to sequence that without help? Like,
absolutely.
can you find the information that you need? I think that's really, it's important to identify the people on our teams who are inherently good at solving a crisis in real time or like synthesizing information,
Yeah.
that's hard to get
That
by
is hard,
without.
and it's so valuable. I often describe it as heads rolls and hands rolls. People who are good at heads rolls are good at solving problems, and they tend to be comfortable being responsible or accountable for things that aren't really directly in their control, like fundraising, getting other people to give you their money. And then other people really thrive as hands rolls, and them. They might not be the best problem solvers, but if you need a process done, according to the process consistently and not falling behind on time, like those hands people, like you can count on them, again and again. And I think, oftentimes I think people evolve between being good at hands rolls and then becoming good at heads rolls, but some people don't. I think it's really important to recognize that in yourself. And that what I hear you saying essentially as a leader, to be able to identify who are your people who can solve problems, and who are the people you count just to get
Yeah.
things done. Um,
Yeah.
I'd love before we close out.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, before
Before
we
we
close out.
close out, I'd love to, ask you, what would you say to your younger self? What advice would you give to yourself, your younger self? Something you know now that you didn't know then.
Um, I think that I would tell my younger self to spend more time cultivating relationships in the workplace. Because if I think back, I've had a handful of close relationships in each organization that I've been at. But and particularly because I've worked in fundraising, I feel like fundraisers are often like the other in the workplace. For various reasons, right? Our work is not in the classroom or in the recording studio or wherever. We're off site a lot. And there are different pressures than there are with other departments. But I feel like I didn't recognize the value in the beginning of really building like happy and trusting relationships across the
Mm.
organization. Because you can't, at least as a fundraiser, you can't be successful on your own. You're always waiting for people to give you information and for other people to make decisions. And so I feel like I really started to see success and to move forward as a leader when I had that mindset shift of, okay, I'm on the same team as the program directors and we all have the same goal. And I, have a former colleague that I'm very good friends with now. And when I first started working with him, I was a development manager and he was a program director, and we did not like each other. It was not a happy relationship. And it wasn't until, the start of a capital campaign where it's like, oh, but we need each other. We have to figure this out. And we literally went boxing together. And that was it. I feel like we were friends from that point forward. But that's what it
Yeah.
took.
Oh, I love it. All right. Well, before we sign off, any final words of wisdom or ways that people can follow your work who are interested in learning more?
I will just say that for all of the listeners who are coming to Boston soon, please come visit us at Old North Church. But also, we have a ton of resources on our website. We have virtual reality tours, classroom curricula, speaker series archives, and a lot of new research into our Black and Indigenous congregants. So I do encourage all of the history lovers or history curious to visit oldnorth.org.
Excellent. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you, Nikki. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. Take care of yourself, take time for self care, take time to build those important relationships, and be sure to subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Until then, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.